Interim President Manuel de la Peña y Peña urged Trist to stay. For weeks, Mexican leaders had struggled to form a government stable enough to even attempt negotiations.
At this time, it was necessary for the Mexicans to negotiate because they were afraid of losing all of their territory, or even more territory than that already occupied in the north and demanded by the United States.
The talks lasted 2 months, but by late January of 1848, Nicholas Trist and the Mexican peace commissioners had agreed on most of the terms of a treaty. The United States would pay Mexico $15 million. The lands of Upper California and New Mexico would be ceded to the United States.
The Mexicans fought very hard not to cede New Mexico. They fought to keep Southern California, which was also more inhabited by Mexicans. And above all, they fought for the area from the Nueces to the Bravo.
These were the lands over which blood had first been shed. But here Trist would not give in. The border with Texas would be drawn at the Bravo, the Rio Grande. For the Mexicans living in the territory transferred to the United States, there would be a choice. They could stay on their land and choose either U.S. or Mexican citizenship, or they could leave. Most would choose to stay.
The border is created, this artificial political border, and suddenly a family, part of the family is on one side, and the other part of the family is on the other side. So it splits families, it pulls them apart, and they are suddenly not only on opposite sides of the border, but politically, because the war continued to be fought in many respects, although no longer militarily, they are now, in that sense, enemies. Although they don't construct themselves that way, or they don't see themselves that way.
On February 2nd, 1848, Trist and the Mexican commissioners met in the town of Guadalupe Hidalgo, near the Basilica of the Virgin of Guadalupe, the patron saint of Mexico. Here they signed the document that would become known as the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. Years later, Trist told his wife Virginia that at the time his sense of duty had forced him to hide his feelings. During the signing, one of the Mexican commissioners, Jose Bernardo Couto, remarked to Trist, "This must be a proud moment for you, no less proud for you than it is humiliating for us."
To this, Mr. Trist replied, "We are making peace. Let that be our only thought." But, said he to us in relating it, could those Mexicans have seen into my heart at that moment, they would have known that my feeling of shame as an American was far stronger than theirs could be.
The treaty arrived in Washington on February 19th. Polk was still incensed at Trist's insubordination. But the president was also worried that extreme expansionists would try to prolong the war. Finding the treaty itself acceptable, Polk submitted it to the Senate without changes. He knew that ratification would face strong opposition from those who wanted to take all of Mexico.
A force must be poured into the country sufficiently powerful to overawe resistance. It is a glorious prospect, this annexation of all Mexico. New York Herald.
But there were others in the Senate who feared the consequences of granting citizenship to Mexicans. Among them was John C. Calhoun of South Carolina.
We have never dreamt of incorporating into our union any but the Caucasian race, the free white race. The greatest misfortunes of Spanish America are to be traced to the fatal error of placing these colored races on an equality with the white race.
In the end, the moderates prevailed, and the U.S. Senate approved the treaty. The United States' dream of manifest destiny was now a reality. From the Atlantic to the Pacific Ocean, the nation had become a transcontinental power. Now it was up to Mexico to ratify the signed treaty. President Peña y Peña confronted extremist factions of his own in the Mexican Congress. Some delegates argued for continuing the war. Too many had sacrificed too much to accept defeat.
When the war between Mexico and the United States was over, it left a profound frustration among the Mexican people, because common people, everyday citizens, had seen their neighbors, their brothers, and ordinary soldiers die in a war that, for all the bloodshed, had resulted in the loss of half of Mexico's territory.
At the beginning of the war, Manuel de la Peña y Peña had called for peace. Now he would preside over the dismemberment of his nation. It was, he said, his journey to the grave. Even so, he urged the Mexican people to accept the treaty.
The people have an incontestable right not to have to suffer more. It would be a great inhumanity to put them through all the horrors of a renewed and bloody battle, especially after the many years of civil war. The truth is that a fertile and beautiful part of our territory is being ceded. I have no wish to obscure the truth, much less to deny the pain I feel at the separation from the Mexicans of California and New Mexico. The territories have not been given up for the sum of $15 million, but to recover our ports and invaded cities, to bring order to a people who have not ceased to suffer for 37 years. Let us do the right thing. Let us strip off the veil that has prevented us from seeing the reality of things. Let us make a mighty effort so that our children will not curse our memory.
On May 30th, 1848, the Mexican Congress approved the treaty. The war was officially over.
It was the end of a dream, the end, finally, of the greatness of New Spain, which, although it had faded, traces still remained. Now, suddenly, it was obvious that all that was history.
I think the biggest thing that Americans have to realize is that the Mexicans have not forgotten this. And so if we think that we are being friendly, hospitable, generous in dealing with the Mexicans these days and find that they have some reserve because they're very conscious of history, I think an understanding of the Mexican War will let us understand better how they feel about it.
I would like to leave as a final reflection the only benefit we had from this shocking experience. Of course, it was a painful mutilation of our territory, but in exchange, very expensively for sure, we found a spirit of Mexican identity.
Para México, perdimos el territorio.
For Mexico, we lost the territory.
Pero la experiencia de ser invadidos,
but the experience of being invaded gave us Mexicans the necessary elements
para pensar y recomponer,
to rethink, to recreate our country and consolidate our nation.
Nuestra nación.
Near the end of his life, a disillusioned Ulysses Grant would write of the war with Mexico.
I regard the war as one of the most unjust ever waged by a stronger against a weaker nation.
There were others who shared Grant's opinion that the United States had been at fault.
And if not at fault, that it did not fully live up to its ideology as expressed in the noblest of the American writings on democracy and freedom, This was an aggressive war in which we attacked a neighbor. And however much we may have won from the war, we do not like to look at the way in which we won it.
The lands taken from Mexico would become an important source of wealth for a growing United States. The discovery of gold in California spurred a great westward migration of entrepreneurs and settlers seeking new opportunities. For Native Americans, it was the latest invasion of their homeland and the beginning of another struggle for survival that would continue for generations.
In the far distant past, the world seemed large enough for both the red man and the white man. He once came to trade. He comes now to fight. He covers his face with clouds of jealousy and anger and tells us to be gone. Saint Agya, sitting bear.
After the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, more than 75,000 Mexicans chose to remain on land which had now become part of the United States. Most would become U.S. citizens, but many would lose the land on which their families had lived for generations.
The United States does not claim them as full citizens. As a matter of fact, immediately almost sets up multiple barriers and multiple obstacles so that they are not considered full citizens. Neither they nor the indigenous peoples that were already here either. And Mexico has lost sight of them, has lost them. So what of them? Who, not only who are these people, but they don't have, now they don't have a homeland and they don't have a nation.
In California, even the wealthy Mariano Vallejo was unable to retain his place in the new order. In what many believed was a violation of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, Vallejo was required to prove the validity of his land grants from Mexico. The legal battle forced him to sell much of his property to pay lawyers. In the end, he lost the rest to Yankee mortgage holders. The wheel of fortune is very fickle, Vallejo would write. It hit me among the first. At the time of his death in 1890, all that remained of his once vast estate was 228 acres, 2 horses, and a cow.
The violence is not just military, but it is a violence of the soul. It is a violence of the spirit, by those who commit that violence as well as by those who are on the receiving end. And from my perspective, we still live that violence. That violence has not healed. We live with the consequences of that violence. And for me, for us to go beyond that is to come to terms with it, is to acknowledge it,